air distilled, suspended animation, moment transfixed. 3:30 p.m. Monday, January 14, 1907, etched invariably in history as the instant that Kingston was changed forever.
At 3 o'clock, God is going to speak. And then, of course, at 3:30, about 3:30, the earthquake struck. I saw this building before. Now this is what it looks like. This is what the quake did.
Kingston destroyed by earthquake. Let them know what had happened to their city, what had happened to the capital of Jamaica.
Just 3 days after the great earthquake of 1907 struck downtown Kingston, several news headlines painting desolate pictures of the city were being circulated in the international press.
Horror and gloom increase. Entire streets leveled and crowds of frightened, shrieking people.
The shock lasted nearly 36 seconds. Pillars of smoke rose in Harbour Street, and soon afterwards, flames shot into the sky.
In semi-darkness, 600 bodies recovered, only a few buildings left standing and not one safe.
The first headlines went out, without pictures of course, Kingston destroyed by earthquake and so on. Everybody was curious. Was it really destroyed? How badly damaged was it and so on? So that people were very curious to see what it looked like, and then the pictures started appearing.
Photography was essentially in its infancy in Jamaica at the turn of the 20th century. Even though several persons operated photography studios, the art form was not a well-developed genre. Photography was more or less a pastime, a way of creating keepsakes like postcards to send abroad to relatives and friends. Several images of 1907 were relayed to foreigners, utilities downed, scavengers in rubble, Kingstonians dazed at the fate which had befallen their city. Many of the more poignant depictions of Kingston circa January 14, 1907, therefore, remained outside of the city and Jamaica for decades.
It's what Jamaicans were sending out to the outside world that has survived. You know, there's really very little that has survived in Jamaica itself, except of course what the National Library has collected. But most of what I have collected has been literally searching the outside world for images. And I am amazed at how much has survived. I mean, I remember when I first saw my first photograph of the disaster, I said, oh my God, I wonder if any more exist.
Today, searches on the largest internet-based marketplace, eBay, yield an image of the 1907 Great Kingston earthquake for sale every day. The event is one of the most reported of its time and ranks highly on the list of the best photographed.
Disaster photography is a very special area. People are fascinated. They still are. Just think of 9/11 in the United States and all the images and the television images and so on of 9/11. People wanted to see what happened when those planes flew into the buildings. It was very similar. Jamaica was in the headlines.
Telegraph and postal services were limited by the disaster, and so the foreign media had to improvise when compiling pictures to accompany their breaking headlines. They commissioned artists to create their own impressions of what Kingston looked like in the wake of the earthquake. Jamaica, however, had its own assembly of photographers who captured several post-quake images and amazingly managed to develop and salvage the collection. There were Theophilus Duperley, grandson of the famous Adolphe Duperley, who printed lithographs of the 1831 Christmas Rebellion and the Emancipation celebrations in Kingston in 1836. H.J. Calm, E.E. Grant, better known for his tourism-related photographs, and John Clary.
Theophilus Duperley actually was at 85 King Street, which is about where the fire started on King Street. He was actually trapped in the wreckage of his building, you know, and to get away from the fire, he literally had to leave his right arm behind. As a consequence of that, obviously, you know, with the destruction of his property, the cameras and everything, there are very few photographs by Dupley, who was the most famous photographer.
However, Dr. Boxer has attributed most of the surviving Quake photographs to John Clary, perhaps the second most famous photographer of that era. Clary had compiled an album with some 23 images of the destroyed city, and an additional 18 of his post-Quake photographs are owned by the National Library. The exhibition's curator, however, votes E. Grant's photographs most emotive and interesting.
He seems to have been in Kingston and took some of the most powerful images of the earthquake, literally within half an hour after the earthquake and so on. So you see the smoke, you see the firemen struggling, you know, you see people wandering dazed down the street.
Dr. Boxer collaborated with Wayne Modest, director of the Museums of History and Ethnography, a division of the Institute of Jamaica, to bring all the disparate images of the great Kingston earthquake together as part of a photographic installation to commemorate the centenary of the event.
As we look back, we wanted to offer the exhibition as a kind of visual narrative for people to help make the reference. So it is here for you to see and say, what if this happens again, that kind of thing. How did we respond to it in 1907? And so utilizing that as a starting point, it can start a lot of discussion about many things.
The idea for the exhibition developed over a year ago, but photographs of the disaster were being collected long before. The concept and layout emerged just 6 months before opening day. The result? A 3-part reflection on the great Kingston earthquake, broken every now and again with bits of narrative. 1907 quake, during, before, and after. The viewer is first allowed a glimpse of 1800s Kingston, routine and pedestrian. Then, January 14, at the turn of the century, the day on which the quake hit, half of the artillery house at Fort Charles sank below the sand and King Street went up in flames. The long but more systematic and planned rebuilding phase ensued.
The pamphlet, published by a photographer named Calm, has a message in it about people looking at the photographs and deciding that they have to build back Kingston. But first, before you do this, could you come to Panama and work on the canal in Panama, earn some money in Panama, and then come back to rebuild your city?
Many of the buildings which featured prominently in downtown Kingston's townscape, such as the Theatre Royal, the Jewish Synagogue, and the Kingston Parish Church, were completely destroyed and had to be replaced. In some instances, the rebuilding process took several years. Post-earthquake retrospection yielded that brick and mortar categorically failed the earthquake-resistant test.
In the exhibition, Ansel Hart, that we've used his narrative also, speaks to the fact that the brick and stonework, the brickwork buildings didn't survive as well. That arches, the one mention of arches being more, stable than the mere brick because the mortar in between wasn't so good.
Most of the churches, for instance, that were of brick were totally destroyed. Coke Methodist Church was not totally destroyed, and they rebuilt it with brick, but they rebuilt it with a safer sort of configuration. They stopped using pointed arches. They realized that pointed arches did not stand up as well as rounded arches, so they went to rounded arches rather than pointed arches in the Coke Church.
The reports showed where the layout of Harbor and Duke Streets pre-1907 was particularly haphazard and cumbersome. It was commonplace for government offices, commercial enterprises, and private dwellings to alternate on either side of the streets. After the earthquake, all the government's administrative buildings were removed to King Street.
They literally turned the center of Lower King Street into the equivalent of a square, but with a road running through it. And those two massive, very modern, solid buildings that scream out at you, this is a post-earthquake building, because it's meant to stand up, you know, if we get that sort of earthquake again.
As a result, Harbor Street lost its status as downtown's commercial center to King Street. Dr. Boxer says that the island's photographic culture expanded significantly after 1907. Several persons started to capture images of the quake, while some practicing photographers like E.E. Grant reached new heights in the profession. Modest's fascination with the 1907 earthquake, however, is defining how we as a people respond culturally to natural disasters. He believes that the significance of our pre-disaster routine goes much deeper than collecting potable water and securing our vital documents. When we pray for the track of hurricanes to deviate from the island, he asks, do we do so with the realistic expectation that the hurricanes will not make landfall? The issue of greatest magnitude for the co-curators, however, is the fact that Jamaica is still to effectively apply the lessons of 1907.